It's September 18th, 2017. Here at the Resistance Report, we try to show context, connect dots. And tonight's theme that unites the dots is the Republican congressional agenda that is emerging, especially in light of continued dysfunction in the White House. The three biggest dots we're going to focus on tonight are, number one, Republicans' last-ditch attempt to kill the Affordable Care Act. Number two, Trump and Republican tax plans that are emerging. And three, Special Counsel Robert Mueller's new warrants and what they mean. Now, the first dot is the zombie that refuses to die. Republicans are still, believe it or not, trying to kill the Affordable Care Act. The leaders of this last-ditch effort in the Senate, South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham, who, in many respects, Lindsey Graham was a kind of good guy. But when it comes to the Affordable Care Act, I don't know what's going on with Lindsey Graham. Now, when I say good guy, I mean, relative to other Republicans. And Louisiana's Bill Cassidy. Who, he's kind of a typical Republican. And what they've done, Graham Cassidy, is together, they say today that their drive to get the votes to repeal, believe it or not, the Affordable Care Act is gaining momentum. And I think mainly that's because the rest of us assumed the Affordable Care Act was in the clear, so we put our attention elsewhere. The Congressional Budget Office won't have time to calculate exactly how many Americans will lose coverage under Graham Cassidy, but a reasonable estimate based on the Congressional Budget Office calculations of the Republicans' preceding bills is 32 million people. 32 million Americans will lose because of Graham Cassidy. The only difference between Graham Cassidy and its Republican predecessors, all of those bills that we worked very hard to get enough Republicans to say no to, the only difference is that this one relies on massive block grants to the states. And when I say block grants, I mean here you have Graham Cassidy, and what they want to do, they want to put everything, the Affordable Care Act and all of the Medicaid that comes with it, the Medicaid expansion and everything else, what they want to do is make it into these block grants, just kind of cut it all up into block grants that go to each state. So here's Alaska's block grant, and here is Montana's block grant, and every state gets a piece of it, which they think makes it politically attractive. Of course, when it goes into block grants, then the public has less and less understanding of what the formula is and what states are going to do with it, and the total that they want with these block grants, the total of the block grants under Graham Cassidy is going to be less than is now spent on the Affordable Care Act. So this is sort of a backdoor way of shrinking the Affordable Care Act over time. And it's a last-ditch, long shot. But you see, Graham Cassidy is still possible. If the Senate doesn't vote by the end of next week in favor of getting this going, this repeal of the Affordable Care Act loses the procedural protection that would allow the Senate to pass it with a simple majority rather than the 60 votes that would otherwise be needed. So by the end of the next week, this is over. This is over, folks. The zombie is dead. Now, but it's a real danger. So we'll get back to this in a moment, but don't forget this. This is going on now. Everybody assumed that the Republican repeal was over forever, and it is not over forever. Now, assuming that this goes nowhere, this Graham Cassidy goes nowhere, the only thing the Republican Party cares about, the only thing on its agenda this fall is creating a big tax giveaway for corporations and the wealthy. And today, Paul Ryan said the Republican tax plan would be ready next week. Now, we don't know exactly what's in it. A few days ago, Trump said, you remember, your president, my president, orange hair. A few days ago, Donald Trump said that don't worry, because the wealthy will not do better. The wealthy will not be gaining at all from the tax reform plan Republicans will be passing this year. He said, I think the wealthy will be pretty much where they are. Well, if you believe that, I've got a bunch of Republican tax plans to sell you. Trump's own tax plan that he sent to Congress a few months ago, it would give the richest 0.1% of Americans an average tax cut of over $170,000 per year. All right? That is in other words, the richest 0.1% of Americans. We're not talking about the richest 1%. The richest 0.1% of Americans would get, each of them would get a tax cut under Trump's tax plan of $170,000 a year. And he's saying a couple of days ago, oh, the rich will, they'll be just exactly the way they were before. They won't get very much of a plan. Just 3 days ago, Trump promised to eliminate the estate tax altogether. Now, let me just tell you, the estate tax is paid by just 5,420 richest families every year. White House National Economic Council Director Gary Cohn, who you may know, or you may have at least seen him around, he's the former president of Goldman Sachs, by the way. He said a couple of days ago, when asked about the estate tax, he said, only morons pay the estate tax. It sort of reminded me of billionaire Leona Helmsley's comment that only the little people pay taxes. Do you remember that? And Trump's own bluster during the campaign that he didn't pay taxes because he's smart. Now, what Gary Cohn was really talking about is how easy it is nowadays for the wealthy to shield their fortunes from the estate tax, because the tax applies only to estates over $11 million per couple. Only the amount of money over $11 million is subject to the estate tax, what Republicans want to call the death tax. And wealthy families use what are called estate planners to put stash away everything above this $11 million into trust funds that can be handed down to their heirs without tax. This is the way we create in America the kind of aristocracy that the founding fathers of America did not want in this country, because they thought it would undermine democracy. And you know something? They're right. Over the next 3 decades in the United States, we're going to have the largest intergenerational transfer of wealth in history. Something in the order of $30 trillion from rich boomers to their children. All of these kids have not and will not have lifted a finger forever in their entire lifetimes to work. You know, you have a lot of people now who are working poor, and you've got the rise of the non-working rich. That's what's happening, and the Republicans are pushing this. House Republicans have cooked up another scheme to take away from the poor to give to the rich. And that's all they're doing. So you've got House Republicans here. You've got Trump and Cohn, all right? They are coming up with their own plan to award the rich with a big tax cut. And then you have Republicans in the House who are coming up with their own plans to basically shaft the poor and reward the rich even more. They buried a provision in their budget proposal. Now, again, this is what we try to do on the Resistance Report, to give you all of this and see how everything relates to everything else. Republicans buried a provision in their tax proposal, their budget, that would make it harder for working families to qualify for something called the Earned Income Tax Credit. Now, the Earned Income Tax Credit is extraordinarily important. This is the biggest anti-poverty program in the federal government. But under the Republicans, they're putting in requirements that would make poor people who are eligible for this tax subsidy. This only goes to people who are working, by the way. You have to work to get the Earned Income Tax Credit. It is a wage subsidy. It would put those who are eligible through a very lengthy and complicated IRS audit before they can receive a refund. Now, Republicans are claiming that the program, their audit program, will cut down on tax fraud. The reality is the biggest fraudsters are wealthy corporations who exploit loopholes and stash profits abroad, over $2 trillion abroad. The real goal of these Republicans is to milk even more money out of the poor to pay for the massive tax cuts that they're planning for the rich. Just when you think income inequality in this country could not get any worse, Republicans are finding another way to drive the wedge even deeper. The last big dot tonight is the latest development in FBI Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation into possible collusion between the Trump campaign and Russians who intruded on the 2016 presidential election. Now, Mueller is working away. He always looks, notice that every time you see a picture of him, he looks exhausted, old and exhausted. I just hope he holds it together, keeps on going. Mueller's investigation is causing an already dysfunctional White House to become utterly paranoid. I mean, you know, you've got a bunch of people in the White House under the Orange Man. You've got a bunch of people in the White House who are scared to death, with good reason, that they are next. That they are actually going to be called up before Mueller, because Mueller is issuing all of these subpoenas. And that's really the news. Because nobody trusted anybody to begin with in the White House. But now every major player from Trump on down has hired his or her own private lawyer. So you got a bunch of people in the White House, and behind each of them is a private lawyer. Can you imagine working, just stop for a second, just think of working in a place, the White House, any place else, where everybody you work with has a private lawyer. And everybody, it's like a vicious Game of Thrones, right? Because everybody is out to get everybody else, and you don't know. Even White House counsel Donald McGahn has his own attorney. That's the White House counsel has his own lawyer. Today's New York Times says suspicions have grown in the White House to the point that White House officials fear their colleagues are wearing wires to secretly record conversations for Mueller. And Mueller's just trying to do his job. Mueller has reportedly obtained a search warrant for records of the fake Facebook accounts set up by Russian agents during the 2016 campaign. So you've got these Facebook accounts. And you have these Russian agents, Vladimir, and the only way to understand what Mueller is doing is that Mueller has concluded that specific foreign individuals committed a crime by making a contribution to Trump's presidential campaign. That is illegal under U.S. law. This is particularly bad news for Jared Kushner. His hair is always perfectly in place. Have you noticed? Just perfect. But it's particularly bad for Jared Kushner. It's also bad for Paul Manafort. And for Trump Jr. Because if they knew about those contributions and helped the foreign agent, they could be charged with aiding and abetting a crime, which is itself a crime. Which, remember getting to that meeting last June at Trump Tower between these three and at least two Russians? So we don't know exactly what's going on, but you can bet that Robert Mueller is closing in. Paul Manafort is the person actually in greatest jeopardy, legal jeopardy, because his home was searched by the FBI. Let me explain. When the FBI gets a search warrant of your home, it means the prosecutor already has enough evidence to convince a judge that there's good reason to believe a crime was committed and that evidence is in your house. That's how you get a search warrant. Also, keep an eye on another aspect of Mueller's investigation. It seems fairly well along, and that is obstruction of justice against Trump, especially his firing of FBI Director James Comey. Because that Comey firing, more and more information is coming out on that. Lots of evidence points in this direction, including last week's revelation that Trump blew up at Attorney General Jeff Sessions when he learned of Mueller's appointment. Calling Sessions an idiot and demanding his resignation. The obvious inference is that Trump had something to hide. Also, watch for testimony from White House counsel Don McGahn, who looked at a letter justifying Comey's firing and made numerous deletions and comments in that letter before it was actually sent to Comey, possibly trying to hide Trump's obvious intent in stopping the investigation. Now, remember, before you get too excited, most constitutional lawyers do not believe that a sitting president can be indicted for something like obstruction of justice. Now, there are certain constitutional lawyers and certain lawyers that do think that. I mean, independent counsel Kenneth Starr in the late 1990s wrote a memo arguing that a sitting president can be indicted. That sitting president then was Bill Clinton. But as a practical matter, all of this means, because most legal opinion is against it, the significance of any case Mueller comes up with about Trump's intent here with regard to obstruction of justice would fuel impeachment. Now, this would require votes from a majority of Republicans in the House, and if it gets to the Senate to consider a conviction, the votes from at least 19 Republican senators, assuming all Senate Democrats are for conviction. So, can I be clear? Just to summarize, number one, don't let Republicans take away the Affordable Care Act. It's all coming to a head this week. This is the last 2 weeks. It's really possible. It's a stealth attack. Call your senators now, especially if you have one or two Republican senators. Tell them you will not support them for re-election if they do this. Millions of Americans are going to lose their health care, and it's unbelievable Republicans are still trying to do this. Secondly, let me make this clear. Say no to trickle-down tax cuts. Say no to mindless deficit reduction. Fight for public investments in our future. Number three, in terms of making things clear, our democratic system of government is at risk. Russian interference in the 2016 election marks a new era of cyber warfare in which Russia appears to be far ahead of everybody else. The danger is that this will grow in the future. 2018, 2020 presidential elections, undermining our democratic process and the American public's faith and trust in our system of government, unless it is fully exposed and we take steps to stop Russian interference. Trump must make this a major priority. Instead, his voter fraud commission is focusing on problems that don't exist. I mean, there's zero evidence of voter fraud, but mounting evidence of Russian tampering in our elections. So with that, let me take your questions. Okay, we have Samantha Rodriguez. Did you watch the Emmys? Yes. What did you think of Sean Spicer's appearance? Samantha, I thought it was disgusting, actually. I mean, on one level, I like self-deprecating humor. And, when Sean Spicer comes out with that, that big desk kind of apparatus that was used on Saturday Night Live to make fun of him. It looks like he's being self-deprecating, and that's funny. But think back to last January. Sean Spicer came out and he lied. He lied about the size of the crowd, and he criticized the press. He said the media are intentionally underrepresenting the size of that crowd. Sean Spicer was a public servant at that time. He owed to the public, to you and to me, not to tell a lie, not to denigrate and demean the press. And that's what he did. And he can't just now come out at the Emmys and pretend it was a big joke. It's not a big joke. That's not self-denigrating humor. That is actually an attempt to brush under the rug something that is shameful. He ought to be ashamed of himself, and in fact, anybody who was responsible for making him and allowing him to come out at the Emmys and joke about his shameful conduct, I think is complicit in that shameful conduct in some way. Am I being too much of a purist about this? I don't think so. Eric Newhouse. Why does the GOP keep trying to repeal Obamacare? Don't they realize it's bad politics? Eric, it's ideological purity. I mean, what these people in GOP don't get is that most Americans want the Affordable Care Act. They don't want to lose their health care. They are actually in favor of a system that absorbs and takes care of most Americans, absorbs the costs. They don't want people with pre-existing conditions to have to pay through the nose. That's where most Americans are. But the Republicans are just listening to the Republican core. The Trump supporters and their core supporters, who are louder than anybody else, they're placing party over the nation. And again, I think it's pretty shameful. Andrew Hook. Currently, many healthcare providers do not accept Medicare. If Medicare for All does not require all caregivers to accept Medicare, won't it result in a two-tier public-private healthcare system, just like our school system? Will Congress feel the pressure to properly fund public hospitals if well-off Americans have the option to get the best care at a private hospital? Well, they already do, Andrew. That's the kind of system we have now. Wealthy Americans right now can pay as much as they want for rare drugs and for the best hospital care, the kind of hospital care that essentially puts them in a kind of hotel-like atmosphere. I mean, there's nothing about the proposals that are coming out in terms of Medicare for All that's going to stop this. But at least Medicare for All will give everybody in America. Right now, there are 20 million Americans, even with the Affordable Care Act, that don't have any coverage, any access to health insurance. They are, if they have a medical emergency, they're shafted. So at least it sets a minimum for everybody. You're never going to prohibit and get around the possibility that very wealthy people are going to get better health care. It happens even in places like Britain or Canada, where you have essentially single-payer systems. And let me see. Diana Brown. What kind of taxes should the wealthy and big businesses be paying that they're currently not required to pay? Diana, we can do a whole program on this, but let me just say this. Corporate taxes are now, historically, at their low. Corporations are not paying more in taxes or a higher tax rate than their competitors abroad. That is a complete lie, or at best it is misleading. Big corporations are making huge amounts of money, have never made this much money, and the corporate tax rate ought to be, in my view, it ought to be increased to what it was 30 years ago, 40 years ago. The individual tax rate, the highest marginal tax rate on the biggest fortunes, on people who are making huge amounts of money, is now about 39.6%. Trump and the Republicans want to drop that because they want rich people to pay less. Well, what does that mean? It means average working people are going to have to pay more to make up the difference, or do without programs that a lot of people need. Education, Meals on Wheels, everything else the Republicans want to cut. What is a fair tax rate on the very wealthy? Well, I'd say go back the last 40, 50 years. Don't go back. I mean, a lot of people say to me, well, why not go back to the Eisenhower administration, Republican President Dwight Eisenhower, where the highest marginal tax rate was 91% on big fortunes, on very, very wealthy individuals, on people who were making huge amounts of money, 91%, even after deductions and tax credits over 50%. Well, we don't have to go back there. But I do think you've got to go higher than 39.9%, an effective rate that is actually much lower than that. It ought to be a minimum of 40% over a certain threshold. And let's say that threshold is $400,000 a year. That's what I believe. We're all part of this country. We have an obligation. It's too easy to just, hold up an American flag and say we're better than everybody else, and yet not sacrifice, not make any commitment for the country. Patriotism that's just showing the flag is cheap. Patriotism, in its real sense, requires some degree of sacrifice to keep the country going. And many of you are sacrificing right now in terms of your engagement, your commitment, your activism, mobilizing, organizing. All I can say is keep it up. Those of you who are not yet there, please do join in. There's a lot of grassroots. I tell you, I have not seen this much grassroots activity around this country since the anti-Vietnam War movement. It is big, it is growing, it is welling up. It is important. Join in. Those of you who are already involved, thank you. Bless you and good night.